Sarah Mitchell walked through the gates of Fort Campbell with the same steady pace she had maintained for 15 years of military service. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from surviving things most people only saw in movies. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her civilian clothes did nothing to hide the alertness in her green eyes. Today marked her first day as a civilian contractor, hired to train new recruits in combat readiness. After 2 decades in special forces, including 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, Sarah had finally decided to step back from active duty. But the military wasn't ready to let go of her expertise completely. The morning air was crisp as she made her way to Building 47, where her new office waited. She had spent the previous week reviewing files on the recruits she would be training. Most were eager young soldiers, fresh out of basic training and hungry to prove themselves. But a few names on the list had caught her attention for all the wrong reasons. Marcus Thompson, 23. From a wealthy family in Connecticut, his file showed multiple disciplinary actions for insubordination and disrespecting female officers. There was also Jake Morrison, 25, who had barely passed his psychological evaluation and showed concerning signs of aggression toward authority figures. These weren't unusual problems in the military, but Sarah had learned to spot potential troublemakers early. As she unlocked her office door, Sarah thought about the conversation she'd had with Colonel Williams the previous day. He had been frank about the challenges she might face. "Some of these boys think they know everything already," he had warned. "They come from backgrounds where they never had to answer to a woman in authority. You might face some resistance." Sarah had simply nodded. She had faced resistance before. In her early days as one of the few women in special forces, she had encountered every type of challenge imaginable. Men who thought she didn't belong, officers who questioned her abilities, soldiers who tested her limits just to see how far they could push. But she had proven herself time and again. In the mountains of Afghanistan, she had led rescue missions that saved dozens of lives. In Iraq, she had trained local forces and helped establish security in dangerous regions. Her service record spoke for itself, decorated with commendations that most soldiers could only dream of earning. Now, as she settled into her new role, Sarah reminded herself that training recruits was different from combat operations. These young soldiers weren't enemy fighters. They were Americans who had volunteered to serve their country. Her job was to prepare them for the realities they might face, to give them the skills and discipline they would need to survive and succeed. The first group of recruits was scheduled to arrive at 0800 hours. Sarah spent the early morning reviewing their training schedule and preparing her materials. She had designed a program that would test not just their physical abilities, but their mental toughness and ability to work as a team under pressure. At exactly 8 o'clock, 24 young soldiers filed into the training room. They arranged themselves in neat rows, standing at attention as they had been taught in basic training. Sarah studied each face, noting the mix of nervousness and confidence that always characterized new recruits. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I'll be your instructor for advanced combat readiness training. For the next 8 weeks, you'll be learning skills that could save your life and the lives of your fellow soldiers." She paused, letting her words sink in. "This isn't basic training anymore. The standards here are higher. The expectations are greater. Some of you may not make it through this program, and that's okay. It's better to discover your limitations here than in a combat zone." As she spoke, Sarah noticed a few of the recruits exchanging glances. She could see the skepticism in some of their eyes, particularly among a small group near the back of the room. Marcus Thompson sat with his arms crossed, a slight smirk on his face. Jake Morrison whispered something to the soldier next to him, causing a few quiet chuckles. Sarah had seen this before. Some recruits, especially those who had excelled in basic training, developed an inflated sense of their abilities. They thought they had already learned everything they needed to know. Others came from backgrounds where they had never been seriously challenged, where their natural abilities had always been enough to succeed. "We'll start with a basic assessment," Sarah continued, ignoring the disruption. "I need to understand your current skill levels before we can move forward. This isn't a test you can fail, but it will help me design training that meets your needs." She led the group outside to the training grounds, where various obstacle courses and equipment had been set up. The morning sun was getting stronger, and Sarah could see sweat already forming on some of the recruits' foreheads despite the cool temperature. "First exercise is simple," she explained. "I want you to work in teams of 4 to navigate this obstacle course. The catch is that one member of each team will be injured and cannot use one of their limbs. The rest of the team must help them complete the course." The recruits began organizing themselves into groups. Sarah watched carefully, noting who naturally took leadership roles and who seemed content to follow. She also observed how they responded to the challenge of working with a handicapped teammate. Most of the teams approached the exercise seriously, understanding that it was designed to simulate real combat conditions where soldiers often had to help wounded comrades. But Thompson's team seemed to treat it as a joke, laughing and making comments about how easy the course looked. As the exercise began, Sarah moved between the teams, offering encouragement and noting areas where individuals showed particular strengths or weaknesses. The majority of the recruits performed well, displaying the teamwork and determination she expected from soldiers at this level. But Thompson's team was struggling. Instead of working together to help their injured teammate, they seemed more interested in showing off their individual abilities. Thompson himself kept making comments about how the exercise was too simple and how they could complete it faster without helping the slower member. Sarah approached their group as they reached a particularly challenging section of the course. "Having trouble?" she asked calmly. Thompson looked up at her with undisguised irritation. "The exercise is fine," he said. "We're just being held back by dead weight." The comment was clearly meant as a criticism of Sarah's training methods, delivered with the kind of disrespect that she had encountered many times before. But Sarah simply nodded and made a note on her clipboard. "Interesting observation," she said. We'll discuss it later." As the morning progressed, the pattern became clear. While most of the recruits showed respect and eagerness to learn, a small group led by Thompson and Morrison seemed determined to challenge her authority at every opportunity. The second week of training brought new challenges, and with them, escalating tensions. Sarah had hoped that the initial resistance from Thompson and his group would fade as they began to understand the seriousness of the program. Instead, their behavior had grown worse. During weapons training, Thompson had openly questioned Sarah's instructions on rifle maintenance, claiming that his father, a retired Marine colonel, had taught him a better method. When Sarah calmly demonstrated why her approach was more effective in combat conditions, Thompson had rolled his eyes and muttered something about desk jockey trainers, loud enough for others to hear. Morrison, meanwhile, had taken to making subtle comments about women in combat roles, always careful to stay just within the bounds of what could be considered acceptable military discourse. But Sarah could see the effect his words were having on some of the other recruits, particularly the few women in the group. The situation came to a head during a night navigation exercise. The recruits had been divided into pairs and given coordinates to reach using only map and compass. It was a basic skill that every soldier needed to master, but one that required patience and attention to detail. Sarah had positioned herself at various checkpoints along the route to monitor progress and provide assistance if needed. Around midnight, she heard voices approaching her position near a wooded area at the edge of the training ground. "This is ridiculous," she could hear Thompson saying to his partner, a quiet recruit named Davis who seemed uncomfortable with Thompson's constant complaints. "We've been wandering around for hours because of some stupid exercise designed by someone who's probably never seen real combat." Sarah remained silent, hidden behind a cluster of trees. She had learned long ago that you could learn more about people by listening to what they said when they thought no one was watching. "I heard she was in Afghanistan," Davis replied quietly. "My drill sergeant said she has a bunch of medals." Thompson snorted. "Medals don't mean anything. They probably gave her awards just for being a woman in a combat zone. You know how the military loves their diversity stories." The conversation continued as the pair passed by Sarah's position. But she had heard enough. Thompson's disrespect had crossed a line from simple insubordination to something more dangerous. His attitude was poisoning the training environment and affecting the morale of other recruits. The next morning, Sarah called Thompson into her office. He entered with his characteristic swagger. taking a seat without being invited, and leaning back in his chair as if he owned the place. "We need to talk," Sarah began, keeping her voice level and professional. "About what?" Thompson replied, though his tone made it clear he knew exactly what the conversation was about. "Your attitude during training. Your comments about women in combat. Your disrespect for the program, and for me, as your instructor." Thompson shrugged. "I'm just being honest about what I see. This training feels like a waste of time. We learned most of this stuff in basic." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Marcus, I'm going to give you some advice. The military teaches discipline and respect for a reason. It's not just about following orders. It's about creating a unit that can function under pressure, where every member can trust that their teammates will do their job." "Is this the part where you threatened to kick me out?" Thompson asked with a smirk. "Because I should probably mention that my father knows General Morrison. They served together in the Gulf War." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Sarah had encountered this type of privileged recruit before. Soldiers who thought their family connections made them untouchable. But she also knew that giving in to intimidation would only make the problem worse. "Your father's service has nothing to do with yours," she replied calmly. "And threatening me with your connections only proves that you don't understand what this training is really about." Thompson's expression darkened. "Maybe you're the one who doesn't understand. Maybe you've forgotten that not everyone thinks women belong in combat roles." Sarah stood up slowly, her military bearing evident in every movement. "This meeting is over. You're dismissed." Thompson rose from his chair but didn't move toward the door. "You know, there are a lot of guys here who agree with me. They're just too polite to say it." "Dismissed, recruit," Sarah repeated, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in life and death situations. After Thompson left, Sarah sat alone in her office, considering her options. She could report the incident to Colonel Williams, but she knew that would likely result in a formal investigation that could disrupt the entire training program. She could try to transfer Thompson to another unit, but that would only make him someone else's problem. Instead, she decided to increase the intensity of the training. If Thompson and his followers wanted to test her, she would give them a real challenge. She designed new exercises that would push all the recruits to their limits, forcing them to rely on teamwork and trust. The change was immediately apparent. The physical training became more demanding, the tactical scenarios more complex. Sarah introduced night operations, winter weather training, and simulated combat situations that tested not just physical abilities but mental resilience. Most of the recruits responded positively to the increased challenge. They began to understand that their instructor was preparing them for real-world situations they might face as soldiers. The teamwork improved, and several recruits who had been struggling began to show significant improvement. But Thompson's group seemed to take the increased difficulty as a personal attack. They complained openly about the unfairness of the training, suggesting that Sarah was taking out her frustrations on the entire unit because of their honest feedback about her methods. The situation reached a new low during a survival training exercise. The recruits had been taken to a remote area and given minimal supplies to sustain themselves for 3 days. They were required to find or create shelter, locate water sources, and forage for food while avoiding capture by the training staff. On the second day, Sarah discovered that Thompson and Morrison had broken into the emergency supply cache, violating one of the fundamental rules of the exercise. When confronted, they claimed they had been testing the security of the supplies, looking for weaknesses that enemy forces might exploit. "That's an interesting interpretation," Sarah said, standing over the open supply box. "But it's also a lie." Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You calling us liars?" "I'm stating a fact," Sarah replied. "You violated the rules of the exercise, endangered the training of your fellow recruits, and then lied about your actions." Thompson joined Morrison, and Sarah suddenly found herself facing 2 angry young men who were clearly feeling cornered. The isolation of their location and the absence of other authority figures seemed to embolden them. "Maybe it's time someone taught you some respect," Morrison said, his hand moving toward his training rifle. Sarah's expression didn't change, but every instinct honed by years of combat experience suddenly went on high alert. She could see in their eyes that this situation was about to escalate beyond simple insubordination. "I'd think very carefully about your next move," she said quietly. But Thompson was already reaching for his weapon. His face twisted with the kind of rage that comes from someone who has never been truly challenged. "You're going to listen to us for once," he said. Sarah realized that her years of experience dealing with difficult recruits had not prepared her for this moment. These weren't just disrespectful soldiers. They were dangerous young men who had been pushed to a breaking point, and they were about to make a decision that would change all their lives forever. The forest around them seemed to grow quieter as Thompson raised his training rifle, pointing it directly at Sarah's chest. Morrison followed suit, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped his weapon. The morning sunlight filtering through the trees created an almost surreal atmosphere for what was unfolding. "You're going to stand there and listen to what we have to say," Thompson declared, his voice trying to project authority but betraying his nervousness. "We're tired of your attitude, tired of your impossible standards, and tired of pretending that you belong here." Sarah remained perfectly still, her eyes moving between the two weapons trained on her. Years of combat experience had taught her to assess threats quickly and accurately. These weren't enemy combatants with extensive training and battle-hardened nerves. They were scared, angry young men who had made an impulsive decision without thinking through the consequences. "You think pointing weapons at me proves something?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and steady. "You think this makes you tough soldiers?" "To thine." Morrison's grip tightened on his rifle. "Shut up. You don't get to talk anymore. You're going to listen." But Sarah could see the uncertainty in their movements, the way they kept glancing at each other for reassurance. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, but they hadn't thought about what came next. "Put the weapons down," she said quietly. "Both of you." Thompson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're not in charge anymore. We are, and the first thing we're going to do is march back to base and tell Colonel Williams exactly what kind of trainer the Army assigned to us." "And what exactly are you going to tell him?" Sarah asked. "That you pointed weapons at an instructor because you didn't like the training exercises?" The question seemed to catch them off guard. In their anger and frustration, they had acted on impulse without considering how they would explain their actions to their superiors. "We'll tell him you attacked us," Morrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll say you lost control, and we had to defend ourselves." Sarah almost smiled. "With what evidence? There are no witnesses here except us. No injuries on either of you. No signs of a struggle. Just two recruits pointing weapons at their instructor in the middle of a training exercise." She took a small step forward, and both men tensed. But Sarah had read them correctly. They were committed to the threat but hadn't thought about actually carrying it through. "You know what I think happened here?" Sarah continued, taking another step. "I think two recruits got frustrated with challenging training and made a very stupid decision. I think they thought they could intimidate their instructor into making things easier for them." "Stay back," Thompson shouted, but his voice cracked slightly. Sarah paused, studying their faces. She could see sweat beading on Morrison's forehead despite the cool morning air. Thompson's hands were starting to shake almost imperceptibly. They were discovering that pointing a weapon at another person, even in anger, was harder than they had imagined. "Marcus, Jake, listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice taking on a different tone. Not the authority of an instructor, but something deeper. "You're both about to destroy your military careers over a moment of stupidity. Is that really what you want?" "Our careers were already destroyed," Thompson replied bitterly. "Thanks to your impossible standards. We were never going to make it through this program anyway. So you decided to take me hostage instead?" Sarah asked. "Did you think that through? What happens when you march me back to base at gunpoint? What happens when the military police get involved? What happens when this becomes a federal case?" The questions hung in the air like physical weights. Sarah could see the reality of their situation beginning to dawn on both young men. They had acted in anger, but now they were facing consequences they hadn't considered. Morrison looked at Thompson uncertainly. "Maybe we should." "No." Thompson cut him off. "We've gone too far to back down now. She's right about one thing. Our careers are already over. But at least this way, people will know what really happened here. Sarah realized that Thompson was more dangerous than Morrison because he had moved beyond rational thinking. He was committed to his course of action regardless of the consequences. That made him unpredictable. What really happened here, Marcus? She asked. That you couldn't handle being challenged by a woman? The words hit their target. Thompson's face flushed red with anger, and his grip tightened on the rifle. This has nothing to do with you being a woman. This is about you being a terrible instructor who doesn't know how to prepare soldiers for real combat. Really? Sarah's voice remained level. Then tell me about real combat, Marcus. Tell me about the time you were pinned down by enemy fire in a village in Afghanistan. Tell me about the night you had to carry a wounded teammate 3 miles through hostile territory. Tell me about watching friends die because someone made a mistake. Thompson's anger faltered slightly. That's not the point. That's exactly the point, Sarah continued. I've been in real combat, Marcus. I've seen what happens when soldiers aren't properly trained. I've seen good people die because they weren't prepared for what they faced. She gestured toward the weapons pointed at her. And I've certainly seen what happens when people make decisions based on anger instead of thinking. Morrison lowered his rifle slightly. Thompson, maybe we should listen to her. No, Thompson snapped. Don't you see what she's doing? She's trying to manipulate us with stories about her glorious combat experience. Sarah shook her head. I'm trying to save you from ruining your lives over a moment of stupidity. But she could see that Thompson was beyond reasoning with. His anger had shifted into something harder and more dangerous. He had invested too much in this confrontation to back down without losing face completely. Here's what's going to happen, Thompson said, his voice taking on a colder tone. You're going to walk back to base with us. You're going to tell Colonel Williams that you resign from this position. You're going to admit that you're not qualified to train soldiers. Sarah studied his face, seeing the desperation behind the bravado. And if I refuse? Thompson's finger moved closer to the trigger. Then we'll make sure you can't train anyone else either. The threat was clear. And Sarah realized that this situation had moved far beyond simple insubordination. These young men were talking about assault, possibly worse. They had convinced themselves that they were justified in whatever actions they took. Morrison seemed to understand the implications of Thompson's words. His face went pale, and he started to lower his weapon completely. Thompson, this is crazy. We can't. Shut up. Thompson turned toward his companion angrily. Are you with me or not? The momentary distraction as Thompson looked away from Sarah was the opening she had been waiting for. Years of Special Forces training kicked in, and she moved with the speed and precision that had kept her alive in dozens of dangerous situations. In the split second that Thompson turned his attention to Morrison, Sarah moved. Her body remembered movements practiced thousands of times in training and perfected in real combat situations. She stepped diagonally toward Thompson while simultaneously striking upward at his rifle barrel with her left hand and driving her right elbow toward his solar plexus. The training rifle flew from Thompson's hands, sailing through the air to land in a pile of fallen leaves 15 feet away. Thompson doubled over, gasping for breath and clutching his chest where Sarah's elbow had connected with devastating precision. Morrison, panicked by the sudden violence, tried to bring his own weapon to bear on Sarah. But she was already moving again, spinning toward him with fluid grace. Her left hand swept his rifle aside while her right grabbed the front of his uniform shirt. Using his own momentum against him, she pivoted and sent him sprawling across the forest floor. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. Thompson was still struggling to breathe, bent over with his hands on his knees. Morrison lay on his back among the leaves, staring up at Sarah with wide, frightened eyes. The rifle he had been holding lay broken beside him, its plastic training components scattered across the ground. Sarah stood between the two young men, completely calm despite having just disarmed 2 armed opponents. Her breathing was steady, her posture relaxed but ready. This was what 15 years of Special Forces training looked like when applied by someone who truly understood combat. Get up, she said quietly to Morrison, who was still lying on the ground. Morrison scrambled to his feet, his hands raised in surrender. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to point a weapon at your instructor?" Sarah asked. "You didn't mean to threaten me with violence?" Morrison's face was pale with shock and fear. "Thompson said we were just going to scare you. He said we were just going to make you listen." Sarah turned her attention to Thompson, who was slowly straightening up, his breathing returning to normal. His face showed a mixture of pain, surprise, and something else. For the first time since she had met him, Thompson looked genuinely frightened. "Are you hurt?" she asked him, her voice professional but not unkind. Thompson shook his head, still unable to speak properly. The elbow strike had been precisely calculated to disable him temporarily, without causing serious injury. Sarah had learned long ago how to neutralize threats efficiently, while minimizing permanent damage. "Good," she continued. "Because we need to talk about what just happened here." She walked over to retrieve Thompson's rifle from where it had landed, checking to ensure it wasn't damaged. The training weapons were designed to survive rough handling, but she had thrown it with considerable force. "Sit down," she instructed both men, gesturing toward a fallen log nearby. "Both of you." They obeyed immediately. Their earlier defiance completely evaporated. Morrison looked like he was about to be sick. Thompson stared at the ground, apparently trying to process what had just occurred. Sarah remained standing, holding both training rifles. The dynamic had shifted completely. Where moments before she had been at a serious disadvantage, facing two armed opponents, she was now clearly in control of the situation. "Let me explain something to both of you," she began. "What you just experienced is what real combat training looks like. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in any combat zone around the world, soldiers face people who want to kill them. Those people don't care about your family connections, your opinion of women in combat, or your complaints about training standards." She paused, letting her words sink in. "They care about one thing: eliminating you before you can eliminate them. And they're usually very good at it." Thompson finally looked up at her. "How did you— I mean, we had guns pointed at you." "Training," Sarah replied simply. "Thousands of hours of training with people who were a lot more dangerous than two angry recruits with training rifles." Morrison found his voice. "Are you going to report this?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The assault on an instructor was a serious military offense that could result in court-martial, imprisonment, and dishonorable discharge. Both young men were looking at the complete destruction of their military careers, and possibly their civilian futures as well. "That depends on you," she said finally. "What you did here today crossed every line that exists in the military. You threatened violence against an instructor. You pointed weapons at a superior officer. In a combat zone, you would have been shot for this." Thompson's face went even paler. "We weren't really going to hurt you, really." Sarah's voice carried a sharp edge. "Because when you told me that you would make sure I couldn't train anyone else either, what exactly did you mean?" "What?" Thompson had no answer for that question. In his anger, he had said things that he was only now beginning to understand the implications of. Sarah set the rifles down and sat on a rock facing the two recruits. "Let me tell you what's going to happen now. You're both going to listen very carefully to what I have to say, and then you're going to make a choice about your futures." Both men nodded, their attention completely focused on her words. "Option 1, Sarah continued. "I report this incident exactly as it happened. Military police conduct an investigation. You're both charged with assault on a superior officer and threatening violence against military personnel. You spend the next several years in military prison, and then you're discharged with records that will follow you for the rest of your lives." Morrison looked like he was going to be sick. Thompson closed his eyes, apparently imagining the consequences she was describing. "Option 2, Sarah said. "We treat this as a training exercise that got out of hand. You both acknowledge that you made serious errors in judgment. You complete this training program with the understanding that any further incidents will result in immediate expulsion and full prosecution." She stood up again, her military bearing evident in every movement. "But option 2 comes with conditions. You will complete every training exercise I assign, no matter how difficult. You will show respect for this program, for your fellow recruits, and for the military in general. And you will never, ever threaten another soldier again." Thompson looked up at her with something approaching gratitude. "You would really give us a second chance? After what we just did?" "I believe in the military's ability to turn civilians into soldiers," Sarah replied. "But that only works if the people being trained are willing to learn and willing to change." She picked up the rifles again. "The question is, are you willing to change? Are you willing to admit that maybe you don't know as much about being a soldier as you thought you did?" "Af?" Morrison nodded immediately. "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Ma'am," with thought. "Yar." Thompson took longer to respond. Sarah could see him wrestling with his pride, trying to reconcile his previous attitudes with the reality of what had just occurred. I think I understand now," he said finally. "What you were trying to teach us." Sarah nodded. "We'll see. Understanding and applying are two different things." She turned to start walking back toward the base camp. "Get your gear together. We're returning to base immediately. And gentlemen, what happened here today stays between us, but remember that I gave you a chance when I could have destroyed your careers. Don't make me regret that decision." As they gathered their equipment and began the walk back, Sarah reflected on the incident. She had faced down armed enemies in foreign countries, but dealing with troubled recruits in her own military sometimes felt like an even greater challenge. The difference was that enemies in combat zones were trying to kill her. These young men were just confused and angry, which in some ways made them more dangerous because their actions were unpredictable. But she had also seen something in both recruits that gave her hope. When confronted with the reality of their actions, they had shown genuine remorse and willingness to change. That was more than she could say for some of the soldiers she had encountered over the years. The walk back to base camp was conducted in complete silence. Thompson and Morrison followed several paces behind Sarah, both lost in their own thoughts about what had just transpired. The weight of their actions, and the consequences they had barely avoided, seemed to press down on them with each step. When they reached the base camp, other recruits were engaged in various training activities. Sarah dismissed Thompson and Morrison to clean their equipment and prepare for the afternoon session, watching as they moved with none of their previous swagger or confidence. The change in both men was immediately noticeable to their fellow recruits. Where Thompson had previously been vocal and critical during training exercises, he now followed instructions without question. Morrison, who had made subtle disparaging comments about women in combat, remained completely silent unless directly addressed. Sarah observed this transformation with professional interest but also with caution. She had seen soldiers undergo dramatic attitude changes before, sometimes temporarily and sometimes permanently. The test would be whether their new behavior would last when the shock of their confrontation began to fade. Over the following days, both recruits threw themselves into their training with an intensity that surprised everyone. Thompson, who had previously complained about physical demands, volunteered for extra conditioning sessions. Morrison began studying tactical manuals during his free time, something he had never shown interest in before. The change was so dramatic that other recruits began to notice. During a break between exercises, a recruit named Johnson approached Sarah privately. "Ma'am, what happened to Thompson and Morrison?" he asked. "They're like completely different people." Sarah considered her response carefully. "Sometimes people need to be challenged before they understand what they're really capable of." Johnson nodded but still looked puzzled. "Thompson used to complain about everything. Now he won't even speak up when he has a legitimate question." This observation concerned Sarah. She wanted the two men to develop discipline and respect, but not at the cost of becoming passive followers who were afraid to think for themselves. Good soldiers needed to be able to make decisions and show initiative, especially in combat situations. During the next training session, Sarah deliberately created a scenario that required creative problem-solving. She divided the recruits into teams and gave them a complex tactical situation to resolve. The exercise was designed to test their ability to adapt and improvise when standard procedures weren't sufficient. Most teams approached the problem with enthusiasm, discussing various strategies and testing different approaches. But Thompson and Morrison's team seemed paralyzed by uncertainty. Instead of contributing ideas, both men deferred to their teammates on every decision. After the exercise, Sarah called both recruits aside. "What happened out there?" Thompson looked uncomfortable. "We weren't sure what you wanted us to do." "I wanted you to solve a tactical problem," Sarah replied. "That requires thinking, not just following orders." Morrison spoke up hesitantly. "We didn't want to make mistakes." Sarah realized that in trying to correct their previous disrespect and arrogance, they had overcorrected into a different kind of dysfunction. They were so afraid of challenging authority that they had stopped thinking for themselves entirely. "Listen to me carefully," she said. "Good soldiers know when to follow orders and when to think independently. You can't just turn off your brains because you're afraid of making someone angry." She gestured toward the training area where other recruits were still working on the tactical exercise. In combat, officers rely on input from experienced soldiers. They need people who can spot problems, suggest alternatives, and think creatively about solutions. Thompson nodded slowly. "So you want us to speak up again?" "I want you to contribute," Sarah clarified. "There's a difference between respectful professional discussion and the kind of behavior you showed before." Over the following week, Sarah worked with both recruits to help them find a balance. She encouraged them to participate in discussions and offer suggestions, while making clear that disrespect and insubordination were still unacceptable. Gradually, both men began to find their voices again, but this time, their contributions were thoughtful and constructive rather than dismissive and critical. Thompson's natural leadership abilities, which had previously been directed toward undermining authority, began to emerge in positive ways. Morrison's analytical mind, which he had used to find fault with training methods, started focusing on solving tactical problems. The transformation wasn't just professional. Sarah noticed changes in how they interacted with other recruits as well. Thompson, who had been part of a group that excluded and intimidated quieter soldiers, began including everyone in discussions and activities. Morrison started helping struggling recruits with their studies, instead of mocking their difficulties. The last week of training brought the ultimate challenge, a comprehensive field exercise that would test everything the recruits had learned over the past 2 months. Sarah had designed the exercise to simulate real combat conditions as closely as possible, complete with sleep deprivation, equipment failures, and constantly changing mission parameters. The scenario placed the recruits in a hostile environment, where they had to complete multiple objectives while dealing with simulated enemy forces, civilian populations, and logistical challenges. It was the kind of test that revealed a soldier's true character when everything went wrong. Thompson and Morrison found themselves assigned to different squads, each facing their own set of challenges. Sarah watched both men carefully, knowing that this exercise would determine whether their transformation was genuine or merely surface-level compliance. On the second day of the exercise, Thompson's squad encountered a situation that tested every principle Sarah had tried to instill in them. They were tasked with securing a village while protecting civilian refugees. But their communications equipment failed, just as enemy forces launched a coordinated attack. In the chaos that followed, Thompson could have easily reverted to his old patterns of behavior. The stress, confusion, and danger of the situation created exactly the kind of environment where poorly trained leaders typically failed. But instead of panicking or trying to dominate his teammates through force of personality, Thompson demonstrated the leadership skills he had developed. He quickly organized his squad into defensive positions while sending one soldier to establish communication with command. When a teammate was designated as wounded, Thompson personally carried him to safety while maintaining tactical awareness of the evolving battle. Most importantly, he listened to input from his squad members and incorporated their suggestions into his decision-making process. Meanwhile, Morrison faced his own test when his squad leader was removed from the exercise as a simulated casualty. As the most experienced remaining soldier, Morrison was thrust into a leadership role he had never wanted or prepared for. The old Morrison would have either frozen in indecision or tried to delegate responsibility to someone else. Instead, he took charge of the situation with quiet confidence. Morrison analyzed their tactical position, identified the key threats and opportunities, and developed a plan that played to each squad member's strengths. When equipment malfunctions threatened to derail their mission, he improvised solutions using available resources and maintained morale through his steady, calm leadership. Both men faced moments during the exercise when their old attitudes threatened to resurface. Thompson felt frustration when a team member made repeated mistakes under pressure. Morrison experienced doubt when his plans encountered unexpected obstacles. But in each case, they caught themselves and applied the lessons they had learned about leadership, respect, and perseverance. Sarah observed these moments of internal struggle with professional satisfaction. Real character change wasn't about eliminating negative impulses entirely, but about recognizing them and choosing to act differently. Both recruits were demonstrating that they had internalized the values she had tried to teach them. The final day of the exercise brought the most challenging scenario yet. All remaining squads were required to coordinate a complex operation involving multiple objectives that could only be achieved through perfect teamwork and communication. The exercise was designed so that no single leader could succeed alone. It required collaboration and mutual support. Thompson and Morrison found their squads working together for the first time since the incident in the forest weeks earlier. The dynamic between them had changed completely. Where they had once been rivals trying to undermine each other's authority, they now functioned as professional colleagues, focused on mission success. When Thompson's plan for approaching their objective encountered unexpected difficulties, he immediately consulted with Morrison, rather than stubbornly pushing forward. Morrison offered suggestions that built on Thompson's ideas, rather than criticizing them. Together, they developed an approach that was superior to what either could have achieved alone. The operation succeeded brilliantly. Both squads completed their objectives ahead of schedule, and with minimal casualties. More importantly, they had demonstrated the kind of mature, professional collaboration that Sarah knew would serve them well throughout their military careers. After the exercise concluded, Sarah gathered all the recruits for a final debriefing. She looked at the faces around her and saw soldiers where 8 weeks earlier she had seen confused and angry young people. The transformation wasn't complete. Military development was a lifelong process, but the foundation had been established. 8 weeks ago, you began this program as individuals with various levels of training and experience, she began. Today you finish as soldiers who understand what it means to serve something larger than yourselves. She paused, her eyes finding Thompson and Morrison in the group. Some of you discovered strengths you didn't know you possessed. Others learned to overcome weaknesses that were holding you back. All of you learned that becoming a soldier isn't just about mastering skills or following orders. It's about becoming the kind of person that others can depend on in the most difficult circumstances. Thompson raised his hand, something he had learned to do respectfully rather than simply interrupting. "Ma'am, can I say something?" Sarah nodded, curious to hear what he wanted to share. Thompson stood up, his bearing noticeably different from the slouching, arrogant recruit who had entered the program. "I want to apologize to everyone here for my attitude during the first few weeks. I thought I knew what it meant to be a soldier. But I was wrong about almost everything." He looked directly at Sarah. "You taught us that real strength isn't about dominating other people or proving how tough you are. It's about lifting others up and accomplishing things together that none of us could do alone." Morrison also stood up. "I want to echo what Thompson said. This program changed my understanding of what the military is really about. It's not about individual achievement or personal glory. It's about being part of something that serves a purpose bigger than any one person." No. Other recruits began sharing their own reflections on the training experience. Sarah listened with satisfaction as soldier after soldier described lessons learned, challenges overcome, and new perspectives gained. This was why she had chosen to move from active combat operations to training, the opportunity to shape the next generation of military leaders. Colonel Williams arrived just as the debriefing was concluding. He had come to observe the graduation ceremony and present completion certificates to the successful recruits. As he watched the final presentations, Sarah could see his approval of what the unit had achieved. "Outstanding work, all of you," the colonel said as he addressed the group. "This training program has prepared you for the challenges you'll face in your permanent assignments. Remember what you've learned here, and continue to grow as soldiers and as leaders." After the formal ceremony, Colonel Williams approached Sarah privately. "I've been watching this unit's progress throughout the program. The improvement has been remarkable, especially among some of the recruits I was most concerned about initially." Sarah nodded. "They just needed to understand what real standards looked like. There's something else," the colonel continued. "I've been asked to recommend an instructor for a new advanced leadership program we're developing. It would involve working with experienced sergeants and junior officers, preparing them for command positions. Interested?" Sarah considered the offer. Training experienced soldiers would present different challenges than working with new recruits. But it was an opportunity to have an even greater impact on military effectiveness and readiness. "I'd like to hear more about it," she said, as the recruits gathered their belongings and prepared to leave for their new assignments. Thompson and Morrison approached Sarah together. Both men looked like they wanted to say something but weren't sure how to express it. "Ma'am," Thompson began, "we never properly thanked you for giving us a second chance when we didn't deserve it." Morrison nodded. "We know what could have happened if you had reported that incident. Our careers would have been over before they really started." Sarah studied both young men, seeing the genuine gratitude and respect in their expressions. "You earned your second chance by proving you could change. That's not something I could give you, it's something you had to do yourselves." She shook hands with both recruits, feeling confident that they would succeed in their military careers. They had learned the most important lesson any soldier could master: that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from bringing out the best in everyone around you. As Sarah watched the recruits depart for their new assignments, she reflected on the events of the past 8 weeks. The confrontation in the forest had been a dangerous moment that could have destroyed careers and lives. Instead, it had become a catalyst for genuine transformation and growth. She thought about the scared, angry young men who had pointed weapons at her, and compared them to the confident, respectful soldiers who had just graduated from her program. The change was proof that people could overcome their worst impulses when given proper guidance and genuine opportunities to grow. But most importantly, Thompson and Morrison had learned the lesson that Sarah tried to teach every soldier she trained: that the military's greatest strength didn't come from weapons or technology, but from the character of the people who chose to serve. They had discovered what it really meant to be soldiers, and that knowledge would serve them well throughout their careers.